dāni jābzu dāgi chūjī gībī tsōnam gī dōlā pīñjir sāngi dōbarāj sāngi chūdān tsōbī chānām nā chāñchū bādō dāni jābzu dāgi chūjī gībī tsōnam gī dōlā pīñjir sāngi dōbarāj sāngi chūdān tsōbī chānām nā chāñchū Jabzo jen dagi chuji gibi sonamgi dola benjir samgi dobara sho. So, good evening. Today, I will try to speak about the mind. We all have minds, but then we know so little about it. I can tell you what mind is not. So the mind is not a form, it is not physical, it is not tangible, it is beyond our 5 senses. But without it, there won't be any senses at all. It is the driving force of the 5 senses. It is the driving force of the universe. When it comes to terms, of course, we have mind and mental factors. But I won't try to be too technical, but rather I will try to use the term mind in a more relaxed way, so that we can also include the mental factors as well as all the other consciousnesses when I say mind. Yeah? Mind is clear, its clarity, it's clear, and it is a knowledge, it is a knower. It's clear in the way that it is not a form. It is clear in the way that it is not a solid object. And it is also clear in a way that it is like a mirror that it reflects its objects. And it is clear in its ultimate nature. Where temporary emotions or mental factors or afflictions can accompany it, but they never become its true nature. So it is clear in that sense that its ultimate nature is clear. And of course it knows. Knowledge, you could say, is mind. It is an activity. It is many parts or many types of mind, you could say, are activity of the various cells of the brain. They are activities of the brain and the brain cells. And the way to approach the mind when you try to analyze what it is, the approach should be different from when we approach physical objects. If you try to approach the subject of mind as you would approach physical objects, then it would be very difficult to really know what the mind is. But rather we should approach it with our experiences. Because we experience mind in our daily lives, because we experience mindfulness, we experience emotions. All those are part of the mind. Mind is just a general term that refers to all those experiences that we have. It's not something that's holy, or it's not something that's really subtle, that is something distinct from all those various experiences that we have in our daily lives. If you approach and try to find the mind as you would approaching physical objects, if you try to use, tools, analyzers, very complicated machines that you would use to analyze things in the physical realm, then it would be very difficult to come to a definite conclusion. You won't find the mind that way. You need to get rid of all those tools. Yeah? You need to get rid of all those other fabrications. And just try to acknowledge those experiences. Just try to accept those experiences as you experience them. Here in Lorig, of course, as you might have gone through some of the outlines, as we have the sevenfold types of awareness, and then the threefold, and then the various different types of categorizing in twos, the twofold types. So there are many ways, and I don't want to go into detail. Rather, I would like to have a longer question session so we can all have something of a more interactive session. Personally, I enjoyed that more. I don't like to deliver monologues, but rather I would like to interact with you, And then I just wanted to talk about concepts. There are some terms used in many of the books. There's one term, meaning generality. Does anyone have an idea what that means? Meaning generality. The word sounds very difficult, Meaning generality. I think it is a literal translation of the Tibetan word. Therefore, it makes it a little complicated. It makes it sound complicated. In essence, when we say meaning generality, we're referring to simply the mental image. So when we close our eyes and try to think, if you were to sort of try to think of your house right now, of the objects in your room, some pictures come up, right? Now those are mental images. Those are meaning generalities. I don't know if that would make any sense. There's a reason why we call that meaning generality. If you're familiar with the concept of generality and particularity, in the collective topics before we study, which is before Lorig, we study these things, these abstract ideas that were sort of extracted from the Pramanavartika, those Buddhist epistemology texts. So when we are 16, 17, we learn the definitions of what is a generality and what is a particularity. And in Tibetan, if you know the definitions, and if you have debated, if you have debated on it for a few weeks or months, then everything sort of starts to make sense. Everything falls together. It sounds very simple, right? In the Pramanavartika, so to the conceptual thought, let us say, the conceptual thought of a table. A conceptual thought that conceptualizes this table, this particular table, being a table. This is an example. In the view of that conceptual thought, this particular table appears as a table, right? To that conceptual thought, it cannot differentiate between this particular table and the general table. To that conceptual thought, both this particular and the general table appear as one. So, the mental image of that conceptual thought is called a meaning generality, because to this mind, this particular table appears as the appearance of the general table. I don't know if that would make sense in how I put it, but it's somewhere along those lines. In Tibetan, it sounds a whole lot nicer. And then we have, I didn't see the term, but looking at how they use the term meaning generality, then we have another term, and I think that they would literally translate that as sound generality, dajirwa, sound generality. So, meaning generality and sound generality. Conceptual thoughts, one way of categorizing them is that there are three types of conceptual thoughts. The conceptual thoughts that primarily perceives the sound generality, the conceptual thoughts that perceives sound generality and meaning generality as one, as inseparable, and conceptual thoughts that primarily perceives meaning generality. Three types of conceptual thoughts. The first conceptual thought would be a conceptual thought that say, if you were to say a table to someone who has never seen a table, then the moment you utter the word table, the person would have a thought, right? So the mental picture of that conceptual thought would be the sound generality, and a person who has seen a table and knows that it should be labeled as such, if the person's concept of a table would be would be the second type of conceptual thoughts, which would perceive the sound generality of the table and the meaning generality of the table as inseparable. And for most of our thoughts, most of our conceptual thoughts fall in this category. To our conceptual thoughts, they cannot separate the sound or the meaning. No? When you say a vase, automatically it's almost like we are playing the sound of vase in our mind, and automatically the image of the vase, the shape, the color that comes up. So meaning generality and sound generality, they appear as inseparable. In the third type of conceptual thoughts, then one example of that is the first instance of the path of preparation. When a person has gone from the path of when a person transitions from the path of accumulation to the path of preparation, the first instance of the acquired path is still a conceptual thought, is still a concept, but it does not rely on perceiving sound generality. Rather, it primarily observes the meaning generality. So this is like the third type of conceptual thought. So within those three types, you could say that they are like, the first is maybe perhaps lower, could be considered lower in the sense that it cannot apprehend the meaning of the object, as it only can apprehend or perceive just primarily the sound. And then the second one, because both of them appears as one, then is the middling, maybe in the middle tier. And then the third, because it does not rely on that sound image, therefore it's considered more higher, and also in the sense that it is nearer to direct perception, you know. It seems that there is an order that first you hear and then you see the meaning, but you still cannot differentiate between what you hear and what you see. And then in the third, you can differentiate and you can see its meaning without having to rely on the sound, and ultimately you can directly perceive it without having to go through that mental image. So those are the three types of concepts. And then now I want to talk about, from the mental factors, we have one mental factor called faith, right? Faith. Faith, the English term faith, I think can sometimes be misleading. Someone might get the idea that when you talk of faith, when you talk of, here I'm referring to the mental factor faith, someone might think that that might have to do with faith, religion, but that's not the case. Any virtuous thoughts would have faith as one of the factors. Now this is according, of course, from the Abhidharma point of view, Vasubandhu's Abhidharma. And there are three types of faith. I don't really know the English terms. I haven't come across those English terms. But to my understanding, the first, I think, could be a faith. I won't try to come up with the terms, but rather I want to try to use more of the attributes. So the first type of faith would be a faith that sort of clears away negative thoughts. So that would be when one sees one's guru or sees a holy image, then in that moment negative thoughts do not arise. So as a result of that faith, that primarily sort of clears your mind, right? Clears away the negative thoughts. That is the first type of faith. And then the second type is the faith that believes, you could say. So believing in the validity of the three jewels, or believing in the Four Noble Truths, so forth. And then the third is the faith that aspires, a faith that aspires its object, aspires to become its object, right? The third type of faith, I think, is the strongest in the sense that it is, the faith has come to such a point, is so strong that it wants to become its object, right? So this would be like in the context of taking refuge in the resultant three jewels, right? So one aspires to attain the three jewels. So this would be the third type of faith. Okay, so now I will stop, and we have about an hour of interaction. So
the universality of mind varies from one's individual to another. No one's the exact same. We have our individual karmas, etc. And yet we're all here today aspiring to perceive something that's of a higher nature, something that transcends the ordinary. We want to have that direct experience on a continuum. And there's an internal struggle between aspiring and being dragged into the everyday ordinary experience of ups and downs. And so it would be very nice to have enlightenment at all times and not be dragged down by those heavy karmas of suffering and being in the physical form. And at this point, I understand we're in the purification process, but sometimes I'm impatient and I want refuge in the divine and have that consciousness be on a continuum.
Yes. Yeah. We, of course, it's yes. There's this internal. You talked of this internal struggle, and many times, it's we have, on the one hand, we have our aspirations, but then on the other hand, we have laziness, right? Laziness. I just can maybe talk a bit about laziness. There are, three types of lazinesses. Did you know that? There are three types of lazinesses. The first one is again I cannot really come up with a good term, but I'll try to explain it. Is the first type of laziness is all of our activities, that is pointed towards inconsequential activities, So all our inconsequential activities would be the first type of laziness. Is inconsequential the right term? Right? Without much purpose or something like that, without much importance, right? So all our inconsequential activities would be this first type of laziness. And the second type of laziness is the laziness that we would normally associate as being laziness. So just sort of like postponing, if we have to do something important, something meaningful, then postponing that, coming up with excuses, and that is the second type. And then the third type is is sort of like discouraging yourself from achieving something higher in life, right? From doing something better, from doing something more positive, more benefiting. So this is, in a way, a sense of low self-esteem, sort of saying, I don't have the power to do this, I don't have the capacity, I am not smart enough. So I think it has to do with a sense of low self-esteem. So, three types of laziness. And these three types of laziness always come, and laziness comes in one of these three forms, and then, tries to overcome our aspiration. Yeah? That is one way of putting it, actually. In a way, that is one way of putting it. But then, laziness is again a facet of the mind. It is not something that is separate from it. So, it's not as if laziness comes from somewhere and then overcomes our aspiration and then it wins that battle, It's not like that, of course. It's really us, it's really our mind, it's really we are coming up with those excuses, right? So even though we have many different mental factors, I don't think that we should view those mental factors as something that's very separate from the mind, We should not really separate them, but rather they are what the mind is thinking, or whether they are just the shape that our mind has sort of taken on for the time being. So it should not be something like, because laziness came from nowhere, therefore I'm losing my aspiration. Right? We should not use that approach. Are there more questions?
When you were talking about mind, I wanted to ask, Zen masters will have questions where they ask yourself, what is mind? Who am I? Or who am I before I was born? These types of questions. I know in the Lamrim teachings, they will ask, what is the object of negation? Do you believe these two types of processes are equivalent or similar?
So the Zen masters would ask, what is mind? And what was the second question?
Who am I?
Who am I? Okay. I think there are parallels. There are parallels there. I cannot say for sure that they are talking about the same thing because I don't know what is the motivation behind those questions, right? What the Zen masters are trying to pinpoint the person towards when they ask those questions. So I cannot evaluate them. But just from listening, just from hearing those questions like, who am I think this is not exactly the same thing as talking about the object of negation, but rather I think the meaning of the question, the purpose of the question is to provoke the person into analyzing what the I is, or analyzing what the mind is. So it's a thought-provoking question, right? And it may of course lead to the question of what is the object of negation, or even emptiness after that. But just from the viewpoint of the question, or just from how those questions are paraphrased, I don't think they're exactly the same thing. But of course, the purpose or the point, the result, I think they're the same. It all leads to knowing the ultimate nature of the mind. The nature of the mind, yes. I heard, there are many different traditions. Obviously there are different traditions of Buddhism, and one particular tradition would emphasize on meditating on the mind and would encourage its adherents not to think too much, and just to try to let go of those thoughts and try to stop the thought process. There's of course that technique. Then other traditions would interpret that differently and say that, of course, there are passages, I think, in the Buddha's words, Buddha's sutras of stopping thoughts, stopping thoughts. And these other traditions would interpret that as that when one thinks about emptiness, then you should let go of other thoughts. You should let go of conventional thoughts and try to have try to have an emptiness realizing thought instead of conventional reality realizing thoughts. So there are different interpretations there. But ultimately, again, there is, I think, a strong meaning behind that statement. You should stop thoughts, conceptual thoughts, because if the only way to attain liberation is by directly perceiving shunyata, then of course you have to go beyond thoughts, right? So in that statement, just as it might seem very contradictory in how these different traditions try to interpret that profound teaching of the Buddha, I think behind all those contradictions, in meaning, or in the meaning that all these traditions are trying to convey the message, I think it's the same thing, that as long as you have conceptual thoughts, then you are sort of constrained, by these elaborations. You are constrained by those elaborations that get in the way of attaining liberation. Yes.
Rinpoche, I'd like to piggyback on that thought and ask you to, because for us in the West, non-conceptuality, non-thinking is a very difficult thought. But one of the beauties of those of us who are encountering Buddhism is precisely that. The ultimate mind, beyond thinking, beyond conceptuality, the clarity that is bliss. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that clarity as bliss, as the ultimate nature of mind, as joy, and as an extension of that, if you would connect that to the Mahamudra and Dzogchen.
That's heavy. I think I should just pack my bags and leave. This idea of non-conceptual why is an understanding, a perception of emptiness that is non-conceptual so important? Why is that? all conceptual thoughts have a mistaken appearance, no matter how correct they are, no matter how incontrovertible, what's the word? Incontrovertible they are, nevertheless they're still mistaken. We would use the word mistaken. They are still mistaken consciousnesses, because they perceive their object of perception as being really true, as having an substantial quality about it, to it. That is the nature of conceptual thoughts, and that is the premise. If that were not to be the premises, to be the premise, then there wouldn't be that emphasis on the non-conceptual direct realization of emptiness. There wouldn't be that emphasis on that. But because the other thing is the premise, therefore we give much emphasis on that fact. You might think, because all conceptual thoughts are mistaken consciousnesses, then all non-conceptual thoughts might be unmistaken consciousnesses, right? But that's not the case either. Before having the experience of directly perceiving shunyata, all consciousnesses, whether they are conceptual or non-conceptual, are mistaken consciousness. The mind that ultimately overcomes avidya, ignorance, cannot be influenced by avidya. It has to be untainted by ignorance. If it is a byproduct, if it is an extension of ignorance, then it cannot go against that, It cannot overcome its cause. So that's why it is a very important attainment for those on the path. Because without having a non-conceptual understanding, realization of shunyata, there is no other way of overcoming ignorance. Only the wisdom that directly realizes shunyata is untainted. All other consciousnesses prior Buddhahood would be considered tainted by either ignorance or by the imprints of of ignorance, either one of those two, tended by either one of those two. With your second part, with your second question, in the Sharvaka Yana or the Pratitya Buddha Yana or the Mahayana, and when I say Mahayana, I'm primarily referring to the Paramita Yana, then the object of meditation is the same. Shunyata is the main object of meditation. It is by directly realizing shunyata that those on the path would achieve the relevant fruition. Right? So there is no difference in regard to the object of meditation for those three paths. Of course, for the Bodhisattvas, when their wisdom that realizes emptiness is aided by the method factors, then they can also overcome not just ignorance, but also the imprints left by ignorance. And therefore they can achieve Buddhahood. And that's the reason why Sharvakas and Pratitya Buddhas are not Buddhas, because even though they might have the wisdom aspect, still they fall short in the department of method aspect. Now when you go to Tantra, then you are bringing in other method factors, right? And meditating oneself as the deity is the primary method aspect. And then as you go through the four tantras, if you go to the Anuttara Yoga Tantra, then you are not have you only changed the method factors, but now here you are changing the mind that realizes emptiness. So you're also changing something on the wisdom aspect as well. You're using a more subtle mind to realize emptiness, rather than using a mind that is a continuum of those of inferential knowledge, but rather you're using an innate mind to realize emptiness, not using first-hand the mind, not using a conceptual thought, nor using a mind that is a more developed aspect of the conceptual thoughts, but rather you're using the innate mind. You're using that mind as a tool to realize emptiness. So there are more subtleties from the subject side, from the subjective experience. And using this subtle mind to realize emptiness, then one can overcome other obscurations. And according to the highest tantra, another yoga tantra, then without using the innate mind as the tool to realize emptiness, then even if you have the right wisdom, even if you have the right method factor, still your wisdom factor is not complete. So therefore you cannot achieve full enlightenment, right? So I think that is like one of the differences. But right now what I've just said is something very general. It's not really detailed, because I really don't know about these things in detail. And I can only come up with that for the time being.
Rinpoche, going back to the second type of conceptual thought,
Okay.
the one where sound and generality and meaning generality are inseparable.
Yeah.
In the case of the deity, for example,
Right.
would we say like the sound Chenrezig would give us the meaning, the image of the deity as we see it, for example, on this Danka, and then the sound Buddha of compassion also gives the same image, and then the sound mind perceiving emptiness could also give us the same image. Can we say that? Because as we're meditating on the deity, we're thinking about all these things. So we say Chenrezig, we say Buddha of compassion, these sounds, Buddha of compassion, give us the same image. Also mind perceiving emptiness, same image. So is that possible? Have all these sound generalities and one meaning generality showing up to the mind?
Yes, I think it's possible. Yes, it's possible. So your question is that, like, whether we use the term Chenrezig or the Buddha of compassion or the mind of realizing emptiness, irrespective of the fact that we use those different terms, can we still have the
same image of the deity is going to come up to the mind, will appear to the mind in our meditation?
It will, yes, yes. But we might have a problem there, if you say it like that. Because, like, in this structure, then it's when we say a table, the concept that conceptualizes a table sees the image of the table and not the image of, let's say, a glass, right?
Yeah.
But if you ask someone, when I say table, try to visualize a glass, right? This could be like, there could be a situation, and if you then give the person that instruction and then say table, and then the person could think of a glass, right? So in this case, what you're saying is a bit like this, that in a particular case, we could be instructed to think of the mind that realizes emptiness as taking the appearance of Chenrezig. We could be instructed to meditate in that way. But that doesn't mean that the mind that conceptualizes Chenrezig need to have the image of the wisdom realizing emptiness.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there are some differences like that.
Yeah.
And still, I wouldn't say that just as the mental image of a glass is not the mental image of a table, likewise the mental image of the wisdom realizing emptiness is not a mental image of Chenrezig. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I got that.
Okay.
Moving forward, so we have, if we think about, we have, in our case, a lot of sound generalities, and we have one deity to work with. Let's just go with that for now.
Okay.
Let's just say the instruction is about this particular deity.
Okay.
And then we said that at some point, when we get to the third meaning generality, we don't need the sound generalities anymore. The deity just appears at that point. Is that what we're saying? Without any sound generalities.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
Now, at this point, though, yesterday we talked about when we realize emptiness, that image starts to fade or get less clear, and then the direct appearance of emptiness starts to appear.
Yes.
So, is
Starts
the
to appear.
Oh,
If you're talking of the transition from conceptual thoughts to direct perception, then of course when you go through that transition, the image of direct perception does not appear. You directly start to perceive emptiness.
yes.
The image, it's not that the direct perception becomes more clear, it appears more clear. That is not how it works. But of course, when we were doing yesterday, we were of course visualizing, right? We were not going through the actual transition. Yeah, so we have to differentiate that.
Yeah.
That many of our visualization, it's pure imagination, you could say. Yeah, because I've had this question that I was saying, try now with the sound deity, try to visualize the tone of the mantra. And then someone asked, how do you visualize sound? Sound is something we hear. How do you visualize that? Right? So visualize, right? And then someone from the audience suggested to use the term audiolize. Right, audiolize. So again, if someone says like that, then you could ask, what is the alternative? Then they might say imagine, but then again you have image, right? Image again has to do with visual things. So imagine, visualize, we can use any term, but it's about trying to come up with a mental picture. It's trying to have a representation, right?
So as we're going through that, through the path of preparation, and the mental image we said is getting less clear, then after that nothing appears? Or can we say the deity appears directly? I don't know.
Okay, so here, regarding the path of preparation, the 4 different levels of path of preparation, it does not have to do with the deity, it has to do with shunyata, right? Shunyata. And again, that does not involve sadhana at all. I don't think so, because with the five parts, it's I mean, it's also there in the Sharvakayana, Pratitya Buddhayana, in the Bodhisattvayana as well. So it does not equate the sadhana practices that we were going through yesterday. So you have to separate them. And with the 3 concepts and with those visualizations, of course, when you transition from conceptual thoughts to direct perception, then okay, you go through those 3 levels of conception. Yes, that is possible. And of course, like as you said, you're right that first we are using all these different labels, and still the same image appears. The image of genericity appears despite using different labels. But in the end, then without having to rely on those labels, the image becomes very clear. But right now, this is still at the level of conception, it's not direct perception.
Just how we say we rely on the deity to achieve Buddhahood, and I'm trying to get how is that happening?
Excuse me?
We say we are relying on the deity to achieve Buddhahood, and I'm trying to figure out how is that happening by the questions that I've been asking. So,
Of course, like with our practice, no, I mean, like with the things that I said yesterday, it was primarily just the yoga with science. So in the yoga with science, we don't really emphasize emptiness that much, but rather we try to observe, the deity, the moon disk, the mantras, and those various symbols and so forth. And it is in the yogas without science where we try to then concentrate all those signs having no ultimate nature, all those signs having no substantial quality to them, right? So that's where the yoga without science start, and then from then on, then it is quite similar to how one transitions from the path of preparation to the path of seeing to the path of meditation, and ultimately to the path of no more meditation is no more learning. Sorry. So then, only from the yoga without science, then those parallels start. But at least in the sadhana, at least in the concentration with repetition and the yoga with science, I don't see any parallels with the 5 paths. Okay, thank you.
Just one passing comment. There is some cross coupling between the visual aspect and the hearing aspect. I remember talking to somebody on the phone, or calling somebody on the phone one time, and the person said, "Oh, wait, I can't talk to you until I go put my glasses on." So there is a little bit of that. You say that the mind is clear light, and that is totally clear. As that mind that realizes suchness is something we're aspiring to, but for us mere mortals, we still rely on the physical aspect, our bodies, and it's kind of, I perceive it anyway, like a boat that we use to get to the shore that we leave once we achieve enlightenment, and we take advantage of the physical aspects, the plasticity of the mind, and the mind training that allows that change to take place, and of course the chakras, the winds and the drops and so forth all have a physical aspect as well that we take advantage of to achieve that opposite shore. Is that a correct perception, that we still have, we rely on the physical, the body, and the relationship between the body and the mind, but as we reach asymptotically reach that goal, then the body kind of dissolves or becomes more centered around the mind. Is that a correct perception?
Yes, yes. I think the body-mind connection, relation, I think is very important. Right now, we cannot rely on the subtle mind. We have to rely on the more grosser mind, which is which which is, I think, more connected with the grosser physical forms. And of course, like with the subtle mind, that is more connected with the corresponding subtle physical form, right? So there's definitely a connection there, and us beginners, we have to make sure that we don't separate or sort of disconnect the connection between the body and consciousness. Yeah.
Rinpoche, I wanted a little more clarification about particularity and generality. It seemed, just thinking about it and reading about those, it seemed like it was presented in the text as two like separate things, but it seemed to me it's more relative. So if we were to use the example of table, are we talking about this particular table that's behind that curtain that's red and it has a chip in the side of it? Or am I talking about all red tables or a group of all three-legged tables? It just seems like it's like a relative. It seems relative, the two, rather than two separate terms. So I was struggling with that, and could you maybe clarify that a little bit?
Okay. So generality and particularity, right? So do we have a table in this room, right? Of course, we have tables in this room. A table is in this room. A table is in the other room. A table is in the building next door. So table is everywhere, right? So that's generality. We are not sort of pointing to a particular table, but it could be anything. But it is nothing. It is none of those tables. Table is not this table, table is not that table, table is not the table in the other room or in the other building. It's none of those tables. But nevertheless, table is in all those places those tables are in. So that is the concept of generality and particularity. And the table, the general table, is not something that is separate from all those tables. Neither is it all those tables. But it is still table nevertheless. So we make this debate. Do you have an ear? Of course, we have an ear, right? Do you have 2 ears? Yes, we have 2 ears. Then do you have an ear? Yes, I have an ear. So is your ear the right ear or the left ear? Yeah? You cannot say it's right? Because the left ear will become angry if you say the ear is the right ear. So same thing with the other ear. So you have 2 ears, but your ear is neither the right ear nor the left ear. So then does that mean you have a 3rd ear? The 3rd ear. So do you have 3 ears? Huh? So we make this small debate, right? So that's generality, is that wherever there is that particularity, it exists, but it is never that particular thing, ever. It cannot be. And it's abstract. It's a strange thing. If you think about it, that mode of investigation is the table, this table or that table, right? Is my ear the right ear or the left ear? Like that, those investigation. If you apply that sort of investigation, then you could also apply it to this table, right? So you have this table, right? But is this table yesterday's this table, you could say, or today's table, or day after tomorrow's table? And if you again say it is today's table, then is it the morning's table, or the afternoon table, or the evening table? And you can divide the hours, the minutes, the seconds. It goes on forever. So those are quite similar. There are similarities there. But still, we cannot deny that there is a table, right? We cannot deny that. Even someone might think that approach might be somewhat reductionist. But then all dissections, all forms of dissections are in a way reductionist, you know?
What is the purpose of that?
Excuse me?
What is the purpose that we keep saying that or not on this? Why do we want to make it general or not general?
Why?
Why do we want to make it particular? And why do we want to make it general?
Why is that important, right? So in other words, why don't we just leave the concept of generality and particularity? Why don't we just leave it untouched? That's a very good question. If you don't talk about generality and particularity, then it might be okay if you don't analyze too much. You know, if you go on about our normal routine, normal life, you know, daily life, doing your job, going to the restaurant, walking on the beach. For that, that's fine. You don't need to think about the subject of generality and particularity, you know. It gets in the way of having fun, you know. But if you want to ask deeper questions, you know, if you want to ask deeper questions, then at one point or another, this thing will come along the way. Generality and particularity, it will come. You cannot avoid that. Because when you analyze, you have to make things very clear, right? You have to enter the world of abstractness. If you really want to analyze, if you really want to ask deeper questions, there's no way that you can get into the deeper world without going into the world of abstractness, because that's how we differentiate what is deep or not. That if you go and make something abstract, this is what we call it's deeper, right? If you don't step into that world, then it's not deep. So that's I think one reason. And then the other reason for I saw somewhere, I read somewhere, I think it was Socrates. He was talking of hoarseness and horse, the particular horse, and then there is the general horse. So one person asked him, when there is a horse in front of me, I only see this horse, I don't see the general horse. To which Socrates replied, that is because you have eyes but no brains. So that's so true, because with our senses, we only see what's in front, right? But with our brain, with our conceptual thoughts, we can create a mental image. And generality, we say, are permanent phenomena. Generality are permanent phenomena. The mental image of all conceptual thoughts are not temporary, they are not impermanent, but they are permanent phenomena. And they are abstract. Emptiness, despite its importance, is an abstract thing. It's not something that's tangible, it's not something that's in a way practical for us, but it's really an abstract idea.
It's empty.
That's right, it's empty. Okay, so, yes?
Okay. I don't know if I understand it correctly, but from the description of the three types of conceptual thoughts, I would think that animals and babies have mostly or primarily the third one.
Excuse me?
Animals and babies, so the three types of conceptual thoughts, they seem to have primarily the third type, the meaning generality.
Oh.
And if that's the case, and the meaning generality is closest to direct perception of emptiness, does that mean that animals and babies are closer to realizing emptiness than we are?
Now you're making debate, huh? Yes, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. Yes. Conceptual thoughts of animals. Do they have concepts? Of course, we would say yes, right? We would say yes, because they have ignorance, and all ignorance are concepts.
Well, they have images, and meaning generality is an image, so.
Animals have that? Okay. Yes. Yes, animals have that. And you're right, yes. So, I think you could then say that, as I said previously, that there is like a hierarchy for those three types. Then I was, of course, referring in the context of the transitioning from a pure inferential knowledge to a direct perception, and in that order, of course, one has to go through those three types in that chronological order. But yes, generally speaking, not all types of concept, not all types of the third concept have to be like superior, or they have to be closer to direct perception. You are absolutely correct. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Hi. In one of the texts, Nagarjuna says that emptiness is the womb of compassion. It seems that by saying that makes emptiness a little more reachable and effective in service to all sentient beings. Could you please elaborate a little bit? How is emptiness the womb of compassion?
Okay.
So we can practice it.
And then the next question will be the last question for the day. Okay, so emptiness is the womb of compassion, great compassion, because, what is great compassion? It is the compassion that wishes for all sentient beings to be free from suffering. And to know that that is possible, to know that all sentient beings can become free from suffering, you must have to know what is suffering and what is the root cause of suffering. And of course, ignorance is the root of suffering. And to know that all sentient beings can be free from suffering, then you would have to know that they can be free from the root of suffering, which is ignorance. And to know that all sentient beings can be free from ignorance, then you would have to know that they would be able to overcome that conception. To know that, you have to know that that ignorance is indeed a wrong consciousness. And to know that, you would first have to establish that whatever that it is apprehending is wrong. To do that, you have to first establish that things are empty. So if you know emptiness, then you know that it is possible that by having compassion, that there is a way to free sentient beings from suffering, because the root cause of suffering has no backing from cognizers, that it is not that it is controvertible.
That it is controversial.
Yeah, it is controversial.
It can be contradictory.
What's the other word? Controvertible?
Yeah, controvertible.
Controvertible. That the root cause of suffering is controvertible. Therefore, that's why emptiness is called the womb of compassion, because it gives the person who has compassion hope, that there is a possibility to save others from suffering. And without knowing emptiness, you cannot never really know that there is a possibility to free others from suffering. Yes. Thank you.
With the hand gestures yesterday, I remembered that at one time I had an energy teacher tell us that so many of these texts were written for men, that women should do them the opposite. Have you ever seen or heard of that to be true?
That women and men should have different hand gestures, or like different
so
placements?
If you showed this one, then I would do it this way.
Oh, and then what's the logic behind that?
They were saying that the energy flow is opposite in women.
So, like, does that mean if men have, like when we eat, if we have knife on the right hand, that women should have in the left hand?
Yeah, it didn't make sense to me.
Oh, okay.
I'm just verifying that was false. Yeah.
Right. I think I don't think that is incontrovertible. Okay, so with that, thank you everyone and good night. Gyewa di nyurdo da do jeje sewang drupjo ne do jejang man le ba de sala gyobara sho kanri rawe korwe jemba dewa man le jongwe ne jeje sewang tenzin jazo ye shave sidye pardo tenjuro ji chögi gyobo zonga ba chuze nambara pewa dan gege tsama shiwa tungye man le tsawara sho